They told me to water the plants and double lock the doors as if I were the live-in caretaker of a home I'd paid decades of my life to build.
My daughter stood in the hallway with her sunglasses on her head, keys jingling in her hand, speaking in that falsely gentle tone people use for the elderly or the easily confused. Mom, long flights are exhausting. Greece will be too hot, too much walking. You'll be happier here. Happier here. As though happiness were a plant they could leave on my windowsill and forget to water. Her husband chimed in from the doorway, and with the house, the dog, the garden, honestly, it helps us a lot. You're the only one we trust. I nodded like they expected. The boys waved from the van, mid-argument about which cousin they were going to beat in the pool. They didn't even look my way as the doors slammed shut. And the last thing I saw was their silhouette, four shadows in a rush, leaving me standing on the driveway with a polite smile plastered across my lips. I waved like a good mother, like a good grandmother. They didn't notice the way my hand shook. They never do. Inside, the house settled back into silence. I walked through each room as if reacquainting myself with a version of my life they had edited out of theirs. On the kitchen counter, they'd left a check payment, I suppose, for my help. $100. As if I were a college kid babysitting and not the woman who once kept all of them alive with my bare hands and borrowed sleep. I didn't touch the check, I didn't even move it. The next morning when I went to pull the mail from the box, the envelope was there, thick, white, official, stamped with the name of their travel agency. I thought maybe they'd forgotten an itinerary or insurance documents, something for themselves, never for me. But when I opened it, I saw their 4 tickets neatly tucked inside, crisp as the day they were printed. Return date in 2 weeks. Their names clearly listed in bold. And my name, nowhere, not even in the additional passengers section. I stood on the porch, staring at those pieces of paper like someone staring at an ultrasound for a child that didn't exist. My throat tightened, but I refused to cry. I'd cried enough in the last few years, quietly in bathrooms, in laundry rooms, in aisles of grocery stores where the music was loud enough to hide it. Crying didn't make anything better. It only made people uncomfortable, and then somehow that became your fault too. So instead, I went inside, put the envelope on the table, boiled water, pulled down my favorite mug, the one Paul had bought me in Vermont because he said the green glaze matched my eyes. He always noticed things like that. He always noticed me. I made tea the way he taught me, let it steep until the water darkened enough to look serious. I sat in the armchair by the window, wrapped both hands around the cup, and waited for the trembling to stop. It didn't. My fingers twitched like they were being controlled by a wire tugged by someone unseen. So I set the cup down and reached for my address book. The pages were soft with age, the ink faded. I found the agency's number. "Hello, this is Bright Horizon Travel. How can I help you?" "I'd like to cancel 4 airline tickets," I said. My voice surprised me, calm, flat, as if someone else had climbed into my skin. "Of course," the young woman chirped. "May I ask the reason for cancellation?" "No," I said simply, "just cancel them." There was a pause. "Understood, ma'am. One moment, please." Clicking, typing, the quiet hum of her air conditioner on the other end of the line. Then, done. Confirmation number is 8259 F-33. I wrote it down on the back of an old grocery list. My hand didn't shake anymore. I hung up the phone and let the room settle around me. The house felt different, lighter somehow, though nothing had changed except the direction of my heartbeat. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like it was sinking inward. It felt like it was waking up. I opened the drawer where my passport lay tucked beneath expired coupons and a box of loose batteries that probably didn't work anymore. I checked the date, valid for another 6 years. I ran my thumb over the small blue booklet. It felt like holding a spare key to a life I had forgotten existed. Then I walked to the bedroom and opened the closet. I pulled out my navy dress, the one I hadn't worn since Paul's funeral. I'd kept it for sentimental reasons, but as I held it up now, I realized it wasn't grief that made me store it away. It was fear of remembering who I was before I shrank myself for other people's comfort. Paul used to say, "Helen, when you walk into a room wearing that dress, even the air stands at attention." I folded it into the suitcase. Next went my best scarf, the red silk one the boys always tugged at when they were toddlers, giggling as the ends brushed their cheeks. Comfortable shoes, my medication, my journal, 3 pairs of socks, a paperback I'd been meaning to read for 7 years, everything else I could live without. Then I booked the flight, 1 seat. Aisle because my knees weren't what they used to be. Athens. The word alone felt like flinging open a locked window. At 6:40 that evening, I called my neighbor Carol. Could you water the plants for a few days? I asked. Sure, honey. Finally taking a little trip? She teased. Yes, I said. A little trip. She had no idea how true that was, how massive a little trip could be when it was the first one taken for yourself in years. I spent the night on the porch watching the neighborhood settle into its usual hum. The streetlights flickered on. The cicadas started their chorus. I thought of the kids, of my daughter laughing, sunbathing, letting the warm salt water wash over her feet. They hadn't even bothered to lie properly. They'd erased me without hesitation, without cruelty, even just indifference. And that kind of erasing cuts deeper. At least cruelty acknowledges your existence. Indifference forgets you were ever there. I wondered whether they'd call when they received the cancellation email, whether they'd check their phones at the airport and see the red notification that said, "This reservation has been canceled by the account holder." Would they think it was a mistake? Would they blame each other? Would they blame me? It didn't matter. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't waiting for anyone. Not their approval, not their explanations, not their crumbs of affection tossed like leftover bread. I went inside, locked the door not for safety but for privacy, for peace. Then I whispered into the quiet living room, "Paul, I'm going." I could almost hear him exhale, that warm laugh of his echoing in the place where memory and hope overlap. If he'd been alive, he'd have packed my suitcase himself. He always believed I deserved more than what I settled for, and maybe he was right. The next morning, I set my alarm for 5 a.m. I woke before it rang. My hands were steady. My heart, for the first time in years, felt like it belonged to me again. When I stepped out the door with my suitcase, the sky was just beginning to lighten, soft pinks, sleepy blues, a hint of gold. A new day, a new country. A new version of myself, and this time I wasn't staying behind. The morning rose the way soft things do, quietly, without asking permission. I stood in my hallway, holding the doorknob for a long moment before turning it. Not because I was afraid, but because leaving is its own kind of ceremony, and I hadn't performed one in a long time. I locked the door slowly, pressing the key until the latch clicked, sealing in the version of myself they had grown accustomed to. The caretaker, the background extra, the woman who stayed behind. A note for Carol lay on the kitchen table, propped against the sugar jar where she couldn't miss it. "Water the plants. Take whatever you want from the fridge. I'll be gone a little while." Nothing more, a simple note for a not-so-simple trip. When I stepped outside, the air smelled like early dew and street dust, a combination I'd grown to love. The concrete steps had chipped edges, softened from years of my shoes tapping down them. I followed the path to the driveway, rolling my suitcase behind me, the wheels making a hollow rhythm on the pavement, steady, determined, like a heartbeat rediscovering its purpose. The ride to the airport passed in silence. The taxi driver tried to make small talk, but I wasn't ready to share myself with strangers. My thoughts were loud enough. Loud with all the things I'd never said to my family, loud with the reasons I was boarding a plane they didn't want me on. The airport looked like a glass palace, bright, reflective, humming with possibility. I hadn't flown in nearly 30 years. Tickets had always gone to someone else. The children for school trips, my husband for work retreats, my daughter and her husband for anniversaries. I'd been the ride giver, the bag holder, the one who stayed home because it was easier. But now I walked through the sliding doors like I belonged, like this trip was my birthright. Inside, the world felt metallic, voices echoing off steel beams, suitcases clattering, announcements blaring overhead. People moved quickly, each with a purpose they believed was more urgent than anyone else's. I moved too, slower but sure-footed. At check-in, the gate agent took my passport and scanned it with a bored efficiency. She looked up, startled for a moment, as if she wasn't used to elderly women traveling alone for no apparent reason. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am," she said with a bright, polite smile. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I didn't want to open my mouth and spill all the words I had swallowed over the years. I deserved to be here. I deserved to go somewhere. Instead, I tightened my grip on the handle of my suitcase and kept walking. Security was a small humiliation, as always. Shoes off, jacket in a bin, laptop out, even though I hadn't brought one. A young TSA agent offered me a hand as I steadied myself to remove my shoes. "Take your time," he said gently. I wanted to say, I've taken too much time already, but again, I stayed silent. After clearing security, I found my gate and sat near the window. Planes glided across the tarmac like metal birds with somewhere important to be. For years, I'd watched departures like these from a distance, commercials, movies, the evening news, never imagining I'd be in one again. Not at this stage of life, not at this moment of clarity. When boarding was announced, I waited until my group was called. I didn't rush. I'd spent too much of my life rushing to feed someone, fix something, soothe someone's stress, stay small so someone else could feel big. Now I moved with intention. Inside the aircraft, the air smelled of recycled oxygen and old blankets. I found my seat, aisle row 17, and sat down carefully, placing my purse under the seat in front of me. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from remembering what it felt like to do something for myself. People shuffled past. A family juggling backpacks, a businessman glued to his phone, two teenagers whispering too loudly, convinced the world didn't hear them. I watched them all with the detached curiosity of someone who'd lived long enough to see patterns in strangers. For several minutes, the seat beside me stayed empty. I let myself hope it would stay that way. But just before the doors closed, a young man dropped into it with a rushed breath. Mid-30s, brown hair, a silver wedding band. He smelled faintly of aftershave and airport coffee. "Long trip?" he asked, fastening his seatbelt. "Long enough," I replied. He smiled politely, then put in his headphones. A man who understood boundaries. How refreshing. As the plane taxied, I felt my chest tighten, not from fear of flying, but from the weight of doing something irreversible. Once we took off, I wouldn't be able to turn back or talk myself out of it. The wheels left the ground, and with them, the part of me that had always played it safe. Somewhere over the Atlantic, I drifted into sleep, not the deep, restful kind, but the fragile sort that comes from emotional exhaustion. I dreamed of my husband, Paul, standing in our old backyard, waving at me. Not the wave of goodbye, but the wave of go on, I'm watching. When I woke, the cabin lights were dimmed, and the young man beside me was flipping through photos of a toddler on his phone. He caught me looking and smiled proudly. "Your son?" I asked. "My daughter," he said. "She just turned 2. She's beautiful." He nodded, then turned his screen away as though realizing the conversation might invite deeper questions. I appreciated that. Sometimes silence is a gift. Hours passed. The Mediterranean appeared beneath us like a sheet of polished turquoise. I pressed my palm against the window even though I didn't have the window seat. The color was unreal, too bright, too bold, too alive. It made me feel something strange, anticipation. That was the moment it hit me. I had actually done it. I was flying to Athens, alone, uninvited, unapologetic. Not for sightseeing or souvenirs or family photos I'd never be included in. I was crossing an ocean because my family believed I didn't have the will or courage to do it. They thought I would remain at home and wait for word of their fun like a forgotten bookmark in the story of their life. But I wasn't forgotten, not by myself. As the plane descended, my pulse quickened. Whitewashed houses dotted the hillsides below. The sunlight glinted off the roofs like tiny mirrors calling me forward. When the wheels touched the ground, the cabin erupted with relieved claps from passengers. A human instinct, I suppose. Athens International Airport greeted me with white walls, Greek signs, and a gentle chaos I didn't mind. Every step I took through that airport felt like reclaiming inches of myself I'd lost over the years. The customs officer looked at me curiously. "Purpose of your visit?" "To breathe," I nearly said. Instead, I replied, "Vacation." He stamped my passport with a swift, authoritative motion, unaware he was stamping the beginning of a quiet rebellion. Outside the terminal, warm air wrapped around me like an embrace I didn't expect. Taxi drivers called out destinations. The smell of olives, sun, and distant sea drifted in. The sky looked bigger than any sky I'd ever seen. I inhaled deeply. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I felt not like someone's leftover responsibility, but like a woman with a life still unfolding. I picked up my suitcase, squared my shoulders, and stepped forward into Athens, not as a tag-along, not as an afterthought, but as someone rewriting the script people had written for her. It was my arrival, my beginning, my erasing of the erasing. The airport in Athens was a strange kind of chaos, not unlike the chaos of my own mind. The announcements echoed off high ceilings, the smell of coffee mixed with the faint metallic tang of the baggage claim, and the floor shimmered with the polished shine that never quite reflected anything real. I moved slowly, deliberately, as though each step could ground me in a world that had suddenly shifted beneath my feet. The heat pressed against my skin, heavy and dry, unlike the soft spring mornings back home. Inside, I felt it even more acutely. The air conditioning offered little relief. It was perfumed with the scent of travelers and luggage and impatience. I found a taxi lined up outside, its yellow paint dulled by age and sun, and climbed in with the care of someone handling fragile cargo. Myself, the driver, a man with a mustache and a wiry frame, nodded and asked where I was staying. I gave him the name of a modest pension I had found online. Nothing fancy, I told myself, just a clean bed and a place to breathe. The streets flew past in a blur of white and ochre buildings, scooters weaving in and out, the clatter of metal against cobblestones echoing faintly through the cab window. I held my suitcase on my lap, my fingers tracing the worn edges as if the leather could anchor me. The pension was on a narrow side street, hidden from the crowds and the tourist buses that rattled past in the center of Athens. Its facade was unassuming, but the bell above the door jingled like an invitation when I entered. The woman at the front desk, a young thing with warm brown eyes, spoke English with careful precision. "Madam," she said, and the word landed heavier than I expected, like a small act of recognition. Recognition. It still meant something to be addressed properly, as if I existed beyond the edges of their plans and their vacations. The room was small, but it had charm. Whitewashed walls, a window that opened to a quiet alley, a small bed covered in a simple quilt. I placed my suitcase carefully by the wall, arranged my few belongings, and sat on the edge of the bed. I did not cry. I had not cried at the airport. I had not cried when I booked the flight. Grief does not always announce itself with tears. Sometimes it is quieter, a stillness that settles over you like dust. You sit on a bed in a foreign city and let your thoughts wander through all the birthdays and holidays where you smiled through being unwanted, where love felt conditional, where your presence was tolerated but never celebrated. The evening was warm, the kind of warmth that seeps into your bones and makes you forget the clock. I walked a few blocks from the pension, just enough to stretch my legs and acclimate myself to this new rhythm. The streets were narrow, fragrant with the scent of bread and herbs and the occasional whiff of sea air that wandered in from the distant coast. I found a small bakery tucked into a corner, the kind of place that looked like it had existed for decades. I ordered bread and olives, paying in coins that jangled in my purse. The waiter, a young man with a gentle face, did not rush me, did not glance at a screen or check his phone. I ate slowly, savoring the taste, the texture, the quiet attention of someone who noticed me without expecting anything in return. Nobody needed an update from me. Nobody was counting on my approval or my approval of their day. For the first time in years, I could eat without performing gratitude, without hiding the weight in my chest. The next morning, I woke early, not because of a schedule, but because the light here was different. Softer, warmer, filtering through the shutters in delicate slivers. I opened the window wide, letting the sunlight spill into the room like forgiveness. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt its warmth not as an intrusion, but as an invitation. I did something I hadn't done in decades. I took a small lipstick from my bag, a deep rose shade that Paul had once liked, and applied it with care. Just a little, enough to mark my lips without declaring anything, but enough to remind myself that I still existed outside the gray routines, outside the muted version of Helen that they had forced me to become. At the front desk, I asked for recommendations, not tourist traps or crowded monuments, but somewhere quiet, somewhere I could just be. Somewhere peaceful, I said. The young woman wrote something down carefully, her pen moving slowly over the paper. "Try Anaphiotica," she said. "It's old, very peaceful, hardly anyone goes there." And so I went. Anaphiotica felt like walking into another world. White houses stacked like sugar cubes on the slopes, narrow alleys twisting and turning, so tight that your hands almost brushed the walls on either side. Cats slept in the sun, sprawled across thresholds or perched on stone steps, their tails curling around their paws. Flowers grew in chipped pots, stubborn, defiant, vibrant. The air smelled faintly of salt and stone and the faint hint of jasmine. Everything moved slowly here, as though the world had forgotten the concept of hurry. I walked until my feet ached, letting the sun warm my shoulders and face, letting the breeze ruffle my hair. And then I found a stone bench, smooth from years of use, tucked beneath a tree that cast a protective shadow. I sat and simply existed. Young couples passed, laughing, holding hands, sun happy and bright. No one stared at me. No one told me I was too old. No one reminded me to just stay home and watch the house. I thought of Amelia, my granddaughter, 16, who sent me filtered selfies and tongue-out selfies expecting me to like or comment. I wondered what she would say if she saw me here, sitting on a stone bench in Anaphiotica, lips colored in rose, eyes catching the sunlight, hair catching the wind. Maybe she'd laugh, maybe roll her eyes. I reached into my bag and pulled out the postcard I had bought earlier, a simple card with the whitewashed houses and blue sky printed on it. I had no intention of writing anything, yet my fingers moved on their own, almost guided by the faint echo of something Paul had said once. Send love where it matters. I scribbled, Dear Amelia, guess where I am? Greece. The sea is bluer than you can imagine. I hope you're well. Love, Grandma. I did not write to my son or his wife. They didn't need to know. The letter was not a report. It was a thread connecting me to someone who actually wanted to hear my voice, even if only through ink and paper. The post was conveniently near a small cafe. I dropped the card in, feeling the weight of it lift from my hands. Then I ordered a coffee, black, and sipped it slowly. Each swallow reminded me of mornings at home when my mother would sit silently at the table, sipping her coffee while the sun rose over the roofs, everything calm, everything contained. I drank without looking at my phone. Nobody was waiting. Nobody demanded my presence. I was here, fully present for myself for the first time in a very long time. That evening, back in my small pension room, I noticed something unexpected. A hum. A tune, soft, hesitant, almost shy. Paul used to hum it while shaving when the water ran over the tiles and the mirror fogged with steam. I hadn't thought of it in years. My lips moved slightly and then I realized I was humming too. I smiled, not a forced smile, not a courtesy, a real smile. I was not young, I was not particularly brave. But I was here, I was alive. I was visible in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in decades. That counted for something. I sat on the bed, looking out the window at the narrow alleys below, the flicker of lamps as evening settled in. The houses glowed warm against the fading blue sky. The cats had returned to their doorways, curling into circles that mirrored the sun-worn stones. Somewhere, someone laughed. Somewhere, a boat sounded its horn in the harbor beyond the rooftops. And somewhere, in the quiet corner of the world that I had claimed for myself, Helen exhaled. I was finally somewhere I wanted to be. Somewhere that reminded me that life could be slow, stubbornly beautiful, and completely mine. I felt in the hum of that evening the faint, thrilling pulse of possibility. It was not reckless. It was not sudden. It was deliberate. I had made choices, taken steps, and carved a little space in the world that no one could erase. The postcard, the bench, the coffee, they were symbols, small, quiet declarations of independence, but to me, they meant everything. And for the first time in a long time, I knew I could breathe. I didn't plan on meeting anyone. I had thought this trip would be quiet, a slow unraveling of the days I'd spent living in the shadows of other people's plans. Athens had its own rhythm, a city that moved in sun-scorched pulses and shadowed alleys, and I had intended to follow it alone. But life, as always, had a different plan. Timing has a way of catching you off guard, of placing people in your path when you least expect it and never asking permission first. It happened at breakfast 2 days after my arrival. I was at the little table by the window of the pension, the morning sun painting the pale walls gold. Steam rose from my coffee, swirling in tiny patterns that looked almost deliberate, as if the universe were doodling on the plate of my life. I buttered a slice of toast with more care than necessary, trying to make the simple act a ceremony, spreading the butter evenly, folding the corners just so. I wasn't expecting company, and I certainly wasn't expecting conversation. But then, across from me at the next table, sat a woman. She looked to be around my age, though there was an effortless vitality to her presence that made her seem younger than her years. Silver hair swept up into a tight, no-nonsense bun, a few rebellious strands softening the severe lines of her face. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and curious, magnified slightly by half-moon glasses perched low on her nose. She watched me with a mixture of amusement and frank observation. "You use too much butter," she said, not unkindly, her voice carrying the cadence of someone used to being listened to, someone used to speaking and having her words matter. I looked up, caught off guard, but a small smile crept over my lips. Better than too little, I said, trying to match her tone with a touch of humor. She nodded, satisfied. Fair. That was the beginning. Her name was Rosalie. She was a retired school principal from Lyon, France, traveling alone like me. Widowed, she mentioned it casually as though it were just another stamp in her passport, a factual annotation rather than a wound. She carried herself with a dry, flinty confidence, the sort that does not demand attention but radiates quietly, insistently. I liked that about her immediately. There was no pretense, no obligation to impress. We started walking together in the mornings, not far, just short strolls through the quieter streets of the city. Athens, away from the tourist throngs, revealed itself slowly. Narrow alleys flanked by shuttered buildings, vines climbing crooked walls, the faint scent of salt carried from the Aegean, the clatter of tiny bells around a goat's neck echoing somewhere down a side street. Rosalie noticed things that others overlooked, the poetry in the ordinary. A shutter-painted lilac peeling at the corners, a dog sleeping in the sun beside a stone statue, a cat's eyes catching the light like amber coins. She didn't photograph or document, she simply observed, truly observed. It was a kind of attention I hadn't encountered in decades, not outside family obligation, and yet it felt gentle, unassuming, profound. Lunch found us under a vine-covered terrace, the grapes hanging heavy and almost sweet with the sun's warmth. We ordered cold white wine that tasted of citrus and summer, a tang that lingered on the tongue and in the memory. Rosalie spoke of her students, particularly those she had found troublesome, the ones everyone else had given up on. She had a fondness for them, an admiration for their quiet defiance. I listened, smiling faintly at the way her eyes crinkled with humor and pride. I told her about my garden back home, the stubborn tomatoes that refused to ripen on schedule no matter how gently I coaxed them, the lavender that had grown wild and audacious despite my careful pruning. She laughed softly as if she knew that defiance well. "And your family?" she asked suddenly, her voice curious but not intrusive. I paused. I wasn't sure what she meant. "They're fine," I said finally, letting the words hang. "I just thought I was too old to travel." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in judgment but in recognition. "They said that to you?" I nodded. She didn't react dramatically, didn't offer platitudes. She simply sipped her wine, calm and unflappable. "You're here," she said, "so they were wrong." Her statement settled in me like sunlight through a window. They had been wrong, and I had been right to ignore them. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in the small room, staring at the ceiling, letting my mind sift through memories and regrets, the sort that accumulate quietly over decades. Birthday parties I had cooked for but never sat down to enjoy. Trips I had funded but never been invited on, the front row of someone else's life always filled, my own space relegated to the margins. How often I had excused their absence. "They're busy," I told myself. "You're needed here?" And yet when the moment came, I realized that I wasn't needed. Not really. Not beyond the caretaking, the meal prep, the dependable presence. It had been a life measured in tasks, in service, in quiet obedience. And now the quiet had shifted. The next morning there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Rosalie standing there, a map folded under her arm, the edges worn and creased. Her eyes sparkled with something mischievous, the glint of someone about to break rules or bend expectations. "Florence," she said, using my name as if it carried weight. "It's not far. I've always wanted to see the Uffizi." I blinked, startled. "You?" I asked, the surprise in my voice betraying my assumptions. "Why not?" she replied, shrugging lightly as though the audacity of it were entirely unremarkable. And just like that, a plan took shape. That afternoon, we booked train tickets. 2 women over 70 buying one-way seats like students on summer break, carrying nothing but enthusiasm and curiosity in their bags. I watched the ticket agent raise an eyebrow but say nothing, and I felt a thrill I hadn't known in years. Rosalie and I wandered through the station while waiting for the train, sipping coffee from the small kiosks that dotted the concourse. She had that way of noticing the things that didn't scream for attention. A poster peeling at the edges, the smell of fresh bread wafting from a nearby cafe, the interplay of light and shadow on the tiles. I found myself looking at the world through her eyes, noticing what I had stopped noticing years ago. By the time we boarded the train, the late afternoon sun hung low, setting the buildings of Athens ablaze with gold. The train hummed beneath us, smooth and steady, and for the first time in decades, I felt the thrill of movement, not the kind you endure on a commute, but the kind that carries you somewhere entirely new, somewhere that feels like possibility. I leaned my head against the window, letting the landscapes blur into impressionist swaths of ochre and green, feeling a quiet liberation that I had almost forgotten existed. We talked, of course, about nothing and about everything. About our pasts, the losses we had endured, the freedom we had seized. Rosalie shared stories of her students, their rebellions and triumphs, the letters she had received long after their graduation. I shared memories of Paul, of the children we had raised, of the quiet victories that nobody celebrated. The conversation was easy, effortless, a rarity I hadn't realized I craved. As the train sped north, I realized that I had been waiting my whole life for moments like this. Not dramatic interventions, not loud affirmations, not accolades, but the subtle, unremarkable gestures of connection. A shared smile, a quiet observation, a kind word over coffee. These were the threads that held the fabric of life together. And here, on this train, with a woman I had just met but somehow already knew, I felt those threads stitch themselves into something steady, something promising. By the time Florence came into view, the city's red-tiled rooftops framed by the soft hills, I felt a flutter of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. We stepped off the train together, two women armed with nothing but maps, curiosity, and the audacity to claim this chapter of life for ourselves. The city hummed around us, alive and indifferent, and yet it felt like hours for the taking. And I thought, with quiet satisfaction, that perhaps the world had been waiting for me to remember that it could still surprise me. That sometimes the smallest decisions, a step out the door, a folded map, a willingness to speak to a stranger, could open entire landscapes, entire futures. Rosalie glanced at me, her eyes bright and challenging, and said, "Shall we?" And I nodded. "Yes, we shall." We laughed about the day over dinner, though a tension lingered in my chest, the kind that feels like an old muscle not used to moving. A memory of years of obedience, of bending to the schedules and expectations of everyone else, pressed quietly against me. It wasn't anger, not quite. It was more like a cord stretched too long, waiting for release. And maybe, finally, it was unraveling. That evening, as I unpacked a small pouch of toiletries, a message appeared on my phone. I hadn't heard from her in weeks, my daughter-in-law. "Did you check the garden? The sprinkler system's been weird lately." That was it. No, "How are you?" No, "Where are you?" No acknowledgement that I existed beyond function, beyond the unpaid labor of care and attention. I didn't reply. Instead, I moved methodically, almost ceremoniously. Folded the navy dress I had worn in Athens with care, rolled the pearls into a soft cloth, tucked the shoes into a plastic bag. Old habits from decades of practical travel. I paused in the corner of my room to admire a small vase of fresh daisies, a gift from Rosalie, left on the little dresser like a quiet invitation to feel alive. "Because you look like someone who appreciates flowers without needing a reason," she had said with a smile. She wasn't wrong. I inhaled their subtle scent, letting it linger in the room, a fragrance of possibility. Later, I placed the phone in a drawer and turned it off. No pings, no notifications, no requests or questions. The silence was unfamiliar, almost indulgent. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel like someone waiting to be included, waiting for acknowledgement or permission. I felt like someone moving forward, one deliberate step at a time. The train to Florence left just after 9. We arrived at the station together, dragging our modest suitcases across the cool stone floors, past cafes where steam rose from fresh coffee and croissants like little clouds of promise. We settled into a quiet car, the kind where people read or nap or simply look out at the world in unhurried reflection. Rosalie placed a paper bag of croissants between us, each one warm and faintly sweet, and pulled her mystery novel from her bag, opening it at a page she had marked with a paper slip. I watched her fingers trace the sentences, absorbed in the story, and felt a strange comfort in the sound of turning pages and the rhythmic sway of the train. The countryside rolled past in soft, golden swaths, stitched with vineyards and sleepy towns, punctuated by distant spires and cypresses standing tall like old sentinels. The landscape reminded me of a painting Paul had bought at a flea market years ago. Cheap frame, imperfect lines, but with an internal beauty that refused to be diminished. He had called it a place he'd never visited, a dreamscape he longed to inhabit. And now, as I gazed out the window, I realized I was finally seeing it myself. The vineyards, the ochre hills, the sun glinting on red-tiled roofs, they were alive, breathing, and mine to witness. We didn't talk much. That was the quiet magic of traveling with Rosalie. She never pressured the silence, never demanded stories or confessions. The world could exist outside us, and we could simply be in it. The train lurched gently around a curve, and she glanced at me, offered the last croissant from the bag, and smiled. No words were necessary. I took it, savored it slowly, and smiled back. That small gesture was enough. It carried the weight of 1,000 conversations left unsaid, a language we had discovered without realizing it. Florence greeted us with warm air that smelled of stone, sun, and something faintly citrusy drifting from the cafes lining the streets. Our hotel was tucked away in a narrow lane, a building with stories embedded in its walls. An elevator that creaked, brass keys with heavy leather fobs, the faint scent of aged wood and candle wax lingering in corners. Our room opened onto a tiny balcony that overlooked the red rooftops and the lines of laundry strung from window to window, an ordinary view rendered extraordinary by the sunlight turning it golden. "I want to see Botticelli," Rosalie said, dropping her bag onto the bed like it were a story she'd been itching to tell. "And maybe something ridiculous and expensive I'll never wear." We did both. The Uffizi was crowded, a pulse of voices and footsteps and the faint, pervasive smell of old varnish. We stood before the birth of Venus, and I felt something loosen inside me. Not awe exactly. Not the sharp intake of breath that comes when something is overwhelming. This was quieter, more subtle. Recognition, I realized. Recognition that beauty often moves in whispers, in inevitabilities, in ways that sneak under the skin until your throat tightens and your chest swells, and you realize you're alive in a way you haven't been in years. Afterward, we wandered through the cobbled streets, exploring quiet corners and busy plazas alike, stopping at a small cafe where the waiter, a young man with a rakish grin, offered Rosalie playful compliments. She responded with ease, flirted back with a smile that wasn't calculated, not at all performative. Simply the joy of being seen, of being alive. I envied her audacity, her effortless reclaiming of youth and confidence, but I also felt a spark within myself, a reminder that I wasn't entirely invisible, that I could still occupy space without apology. Night fell, soft and fragrant, over the Oltrarno side of the river. We dined at a tucked-away trattoria far from the crowds, where the pasta was tossed simply in butter and sage, and the red wine came in short, heavy glasses that warmed the hands. Laughter came easier than it had in years, unpolished, spontaneous. Rosalie leaned toward me, her voice low and conspiratorial. "You're different now?" "How so?" I asked, unsure if I wanted the answer. "You sit taller," she said softly. "Less folded?" I didn't know what to say. I nodded instead, letting her words settle like sunlight through a window onto the floor. Later, back in the room, habit pushed me to check my phone. 24 missed calls. 14 from my daughter-in-law, the rest from my son. I didn't listen to the voicemails. Instead, I scrolled through the messages. "Where are you? Are you okay? Did something happen?" Then one voice memo, clipped and tired, my son's voice. "Mom, please call us. The kids are upset. We thought you'd be home." I stared at the screen, trying to summon some reaction, anger, sadness, guilt. None came. Instead, I felt a deliberate distance, a space I hadn't realized I'd craved. Not cruelty, not defiance, just breathing room, the air between me and all the obligations and expectations that had once suffocated me. The next day, Rosalie slept in while I wandered alone through the quieter parts of Florence. I let the streets guide me rather than a map. I ducked into an artisan shop filled with linen skirts and delicate silver earrings, letting my fingers brush the fabrics and metals without buying a thing. I was rediscovering something almost forgotten. The pleasure of looking, of curiosity untainted by expectation. In the afternoon, we took the bus up to Fiesole, a hilltop town above Florence. The air was cooler there, the noise of the city a faint murmur below us. We sat under an ancient tree, its branches casting patterned shadows across the cobbled stones. Below, the city sprawled, terracotta roofs and domes punctuated by distant church towers. "This," I said softly, not meaning the view exactly, "this was missing." Rosalie nodded as if she understood the weight behind the words, the years of absence I had been carrying. Returning to the hotel that evening, another message awaited. My son again. Mom, did you cancel our vacation on purpose? We got to the airport and never mind, just please call, we're worried. I turned the phone off again. As we walked the narrow streets back to the hotel, Rosalie glanced at me and smiled. So, where next? She asked, and in that single question lay all the promise of the days ahead, all the audacity of two women reclaiming the rhythm of their own lives. I breathed in the warm evening air, the scent of stone, wine, and baking bread weaving together like a song. I smiled, feeling something I hadn't in decades, unshackled possibility. Wherever the world takes us, I said, and I meant it. Lisbon, I said, almost to myself, letting the word roll off my tongue. Always wanted to hear Fadu live. Rosalie grinned, that playful spark in her eye that never failed to make me feel both older and younger at the same time. Let's go then, she said, and with that simple agreement we were off. Lisbon welcomed us like an old friend, warm and a little disheveled, with narrow streets that seemed to lean in and whisper secrets to anyone willing to listen. The sidewalks shimmered from last night's rain, reflecting streetlights and the fading glint of neon signs. Even the air seemed to hum, a quiet, insistent pulse, like the city knew something the rest of the world had forgotten. That life can be stubbornly beautiful even when it's messy. We stayed in a small guest house tucked into one of the winding alleyways, its walls tiled in the soft blues and whites of the sea. Our room had a tiny balcony that overlooked a square where children kicked a worn ball between rusted benches, the echoes of their laughter bouncing off buildings with chipped paint. I stood there for a long while on that first evening, arms crossed against the slight chill, watching the sun slip behind the terracotta rooftops. Below me, voices tumbled through the square in soft, fast Portuguese, words that sounded like wind rustling through olive trees. I didn't understand them, but I felt them. Rosalie wasn't feeling well that day. Nothing serious, just a low fever, aching joints, the kind of thing you dismiss when life demands more of you than your body wants to give. It's nothing, she waved me off, trying to hide the weariness in her posture. I've been worse, go out, see the city. But I didn't, I brought her tea instead. Sat by her bed, holding the cup between my hands, and read aloud from a book we'd picked up in Florence. She dozed halfway through a paragraph, her breathing even, her face more relaxed than it had been for days. Watching her, I remembered Paul in the hospital all those years ago. The quiet exhalations, the small gestures of comfort, the profound intimacy of simply being present. I realized then something I'd never quite admitted to myself. I had spent a lifetime caring for others, children, grandchildren, Paul, even the dog. But this, sitting here with a warm cup in my hands, feeling the weight of another's small recovery, this was not obligation. This was choice. That night I cooked for us. Nothing fancy, just eggs, bread, and tomatoes from a corner vendor who smiled like we'd known each other for decades. We ate on the balcony, wrapped in shawls against the evening breeze. Rosalie's color had returned, her voice stronger. She looked at me and said simply, "Thank you." I raised an eyebrow. "For the eggs?" I asked. "For not leaving," she said, and for a moment I had no words. I nodded, took another sip of tea, and let the silence between us speak. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Fadu drifting from a square below our balcony. That music, haunting, melancholic, ancient, reached into the marrow of your bones, telling stories that had no need for translation. The singer's voice cracked in places, but that only made it more human, more necessary. I stood there barefoot, arms crossed against the morning chill, letting the melody settle inside me. It was grief and longing and joy all at once. By the time Rosalie was ready, the city had fully awakened. We walked slowly, her still recovering, me savoring each new corner and twist in the streets. We passed a church, its doors wide open. Incense curled into the street like smoke from a candle that had been burning all night. I didn't go in. I simply watched a woman kneel and light a candle, pressing her palms together as if holding something fragile between them. The tenderness of that small, private act made me feel both outside and deeply connected to life all at once. Back at the guest house, I turned my phone on. 5 new messages, my daughter-in-law again. "This isn't funny, Helen," and then, "We're not sure what to tell the kids." From my son, "You've made your point," had I. I wasn't sure what point they thought I was making. I hadn't said a word since they left me behind, yet here they were, scrambling as if my absence carried some lesson they had overlooked. Rosalie watched silently as I read the messages, pouring tea into a cup without asking questions, without commentary. Her quiet presence was enough. That night, we found a fado bar tucked between laundry-strewn alleyways. No menu, no tourists, just locals drinking slowly, glasses clinking in rhythm with the singer's rusted silk voice. She sang of longing, of being left behind, of rising again after despair. I closed my eyes, letting the music wash over me, resonating deep in my chest. She wasn't singing for me, not intentionally, but I understood every note, every heartbreak embedded in the lines. It was as if the city itself was teaching me how to feel again, how to honor my own absence from the life that had tried to overlook me. The letter came quietly the next morning, folded neatly into thirds, slipped under our door without fanfare. No stamp, no envelope, just my name written in my son's familiar hand. I knew before I picked it up who it was. I sat on the edge of the bed, letter unopened in my lap, while Rosalie brushed her scarf in the mirror. She didn't ask about it. She understood the unspoken, that some matters are heavy and private and the responsibility of them is not hers to share. I unfolded it carefully. The words were short, clipped, formal, the same way he filled out forms. "Mom, we don't understand what you're doing. The kids are confused. Amelia cried. We thought you were just upset, but this is something else. If you're trying to punish us, you've made your point. Come home. Let's talk, please, David." That was it. No apology for excluding me. No acknowledgement of the countless vacations and birthdays I had funded or quietly missed. Only concern that their image, their idea of themselves, was being disturbed by my absence. I folded the letter again and placed it in the drawer beside the bed. Rosalie turned to me with a mischievous arch of her eyebrow. "So," she said, "are we having breakfast or just mourning the weak penmanship of disappointing sons?" I laughed, unexpectedly, the sound catching me off guard. We ate in the courtyard, sunlight filtering through the grapevines overhead, warm on our shoulders, the smell of sweet bread and strong coffee weaving through the morning. Rosalie chattered about local tram routes and her desire to visit the Tile Museum. I nodded, but my thoughts wandered to the letter and the absence it marked. I hadn't left to punish anyone. I had left because I had stopped asking for a seat at a table that had shrunk every year, because birthdays had become texts, holidays were too busy, and vacations came with conditions and whispered apologies that never included me. I hadn't stopped being a mother or a grandmother, they had simply stopped seeing me. Later, I found myself alone on a low stone wall by the river. Boats drifted slowly past and pigeons squabbled over crumbs at my feet. My hands rested lightly in my lap, mirroring the stillness of the water. I thought of Amelia, 16, bright-eyed, smudged eyeliner, forever curious. The last time we spoke, she asked me how to fry an egg. She called me the egg whisperer. She didn't know about the tickets, didn't know I had canceled the trip. She probably assumed I'd been overlooked or had declined. I pulled out my phone and typed carefully, "Sweetheart, I'm fine, I'm traveling." Not angry, not hiding, just needed a bit of sky. "Don't worry, love you." I hit send without hesitation, letting the words float to her like a feather in the wind. Rosalie found me half an hour later, 2 small paper bags in hand. "Pasties de nata," she said with a grin. "You can't leave Lisbon without trying these." We ate in companionable silence, watching the shadows stretch long across the cobblestones. That evening, the guesthouse manager appeared at the door with a puzzled expression. "Mrs. Helen," he said hesitantly, "your daughter-in-law called. She said the children miss you." I nodded. "Thank you," I said. He paused. "Do you want to call her back?" "No," I said. He seemed unsure, then left. I slept deeply that night, the kind of sleep that comes only when you've stopped expecting to be needed and have begun choosing to be whole. The next morning, Rosalie showed me 2 train schedules, one for Madrid, one for Seville. "Your pick," she said. I looked out the window at the cloudless sky, the scent of roasted chestnuts drifting from the street below, life in its unpolished glory. "Seville," I said. Let's see what else they said I was too old for. Seville felt like fire in the bones, not just from the heat, though it pressed down on us like a warm hand, but from the life that pulsed in every alley, every window, every late-night voice echoing across the stone streets. It wasn't a city that asked permission to be seen. It simply was, bold, proud, unapologetic. We arrived in the late afternoon. Our hotel was tucked between a bakery and a small shoe shop that smelled of leather and dust. The room was modest, but the balcony overlooked a courtyard with orange trees, their scent mingling with the distant hum of a flamenco guitar. Rosalie took one look around and declared, "This place demands earrings." She disappeared into the bathroom and emerged minutes later with silver hoops that danced with her every move. I had none to match, but I pinned back my hair and applied lipstick, the same tube I'd found at the bottom of my bag in Athens. It was almost empty, and for the first time in years I considered buying another. That evening we wandered the streets without a plan. They were alive, not in the noisy tourist way, but in the way old cities breathe after sunset. We followed the sound of clapping and landed in a courtyard restaurant where a small group performed flamenco, not for tips, not for cameras, but for each other. A woman danced, her face neither smiling nor posed, just radiating something I hadn't seen in a long time, presence. She existed entirely in that moment, unapologetically herself. Rosalie leaned in and whispered, "She's older than we are." I looked closer. Mid-70s, maybe. Her feet struck the floor with the force of a promise. The crowd applauded. I didn't. I just watched, heart suddenly too full. The next day, we explored the Alcazar. Its walls told stories in tiles and arches, and I thought of the stories I had locked inside me. Years of quiet endurance, of swallowing disappointment to make room for duty. I wandered the gardens as though I belonged there. No one stopped me, no one called me dear, no one offered their arm as if I were fragile. For once, I didn't feel fragile. That afternoon, at a cafe under a striped awning, Rosalie sipped lemonade while scrolling on her tablet. I watched people walk by. That's when I saw a family, 2 parents, 2 teenagers. The father looked tired. The mother walked slightly ahead, phone in hand. The girl had headphones on. The boy carried a small plastic bag. It should have been unremarkable, but the woman's haircut, sharp blonde, was too familiar. My breath caught. It wasn't her. Of course not. But for a moment, I saw my daughter-in-law's silhouette in that stranger, and my chest tightened, not from hurt, but from something unnameable. It passed. Back at the hotel, a message from Amelia lit up my screen. "Grandma, where are you now? Your photo from Lisbon was amazing. I showed it to my art teacher. She said, you have a really good eye. Can I call you soon?" I smiled, then frowned. I hadn't sent her a photo. Rosalie, always ready, said, "Of course." I opened the gallery. There it was, me on the balcony in Lisbon, one arm resting on the iron rail, looking out at the street. I didn't remember her taking it, didn't remember standing still that way. But there I was, unposed, unapologetic, just existing. I typed back, "Seville now. It's hot, stubborn, and full of beautiful noise. I'll call tomorrow, you'd love it here." That night, I lay in bed thinking of all the places I'd never been because someone had to stay behind and hold everything together. The times I'd said, "You go ahead, I'll be fine," when I wasn't. Vacations I funded but wasn't invited on. Weddings I helped plan but sat at the edge of. But now here I was in Seville, wearing a soft cotton nightgown from a street vendor who called me La Señora Valiant, the brave lady. I closed my eyes and let music from a distant radio float through the window. Tomorrow I'd dance, not for anyone, just to remember I could. It started with a call I didn't answer, then another. By mid-morning, the screen lit up again. David, same name, same number, same silence. 26 calls in 2 days, one voicemail after another. I didn't listen. I wasn't angry, not anymore. I was done asking to be heard. Rosalie was already dressed when I stepped out of the bathroom. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat and a linen dress that floated behind her. "There's a market by the river," she said. "I feel like haggling." We walked slowly, the sun licking the back of my neck like a mischievous child. The market was alive, real, messy, uncurated. Men shouting prices, women laughing, children darting between stalls with sticky fingers. I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot unthreading. I bought a scarf, yellow as marigolds, catching the light as if it belonged in my life. While Rosalie negotiated over a basket, I checked my messages. Not David, Amelia. Her voice was soft, uncertain. "Grandma, I miss you. Mom and Dad are freaking out. They think you're trying to prove something. I don't. I think you just got tired of being left behind. Anyway, I hope you're safe. You look happy in that photo. I've never seen you like that. Just call me, okay? Even if it's just for a minute. Even if it's just for a minute." The words cracked something open. I walked back to the hotel, scarf in hand. I called. Amelia answered on the second ring. "Grandma," her voice wavered. "I'm here, sweetheart." "Oh my God, wait. I was starting to think you'd gone totally rogue," she said, slightly trembling. "Not rogue. Just found something I'd forgotten I lost." "What?" "Myself." She was quiet. "I think I get it more than Mom and Dad do." I believed her. We talked 15 minutes about school, drawings, boys, normal, precious things. Then she asked carefully, "Are you coming back?" "I will," I said, "but not to the house. Caddy's next, then home." "Okay, be safe, Grandma, send more photos," I promised. That night on the balcony, the sunset burned the sky red. "I think they're starting to understand," I said. "Who?" "My family," Rosalie chewed slowly, then nodded. "About time." I didn't sleep much, not from restlessness, but a quiet shift, a new weight, not heavy, but solid. Lisbon had been soft, aching. Florence, graceful. Seville gave me heat and thunder, shook loose what was trapped in apology. I tied the yellow scarf around my neck, ticket in hand, and boarded the train to Granada. Rosalie hummed, her morning hums were rare. "What's the occasion?" I asked. "We're seeing the Alhambra. I hum for architecture," she said. I smiled, folded hands in my lap, watching the countryside blur. Granada was quieter, respectful, streets like whispered secrets. Our inn smelled of old wood and salt. Rooftops, laundry lines, truth in a view. I thought of David, Laura, what I would say. I wrote it down for me. "I left not because I hated you. I left because I didn't want to be the woman who only existed when asked to stay behind. I wasn't always tired, I just got tired of not being seen. I don't regret being a mother. I regret disappearing into someone else." The climb to the Alhambra was steep, knees ached. I kept going, not to prove anything, to see it for myself. Arches and fountains, hands that shaped stone, people who paused to behold what could not be rushed. Rosalie photographed me sitting on a bench, light and shadow framing me. "You look like someone who remembered something important," she said. "I have," I said. "I remembered I was never just someone who stayed behind." That night, Amelia's voice message came. David was finally listening, I felt it. Caddies followed, sea air tangling hair, salt-scented rooms, fishing boats at dusk, steady waves. My phone buzzed. "David. Mom, I don't know what to say, I love you. Please come home, not for us, for you, but I miss you." I typed the letter from Granada, sent it, and let the sea answer for me. Rosalie smiled knowingly. "About damn time," she said. Weeks later, home, quiet, tea. David and Laura came. Honest, humbled, small. We built a new shape slowly around shared silence, gentle words, lemon tart. Amelia read her own list, lessons about self, boundaries, presence, courage. I listened, proud, patient. I closed the chapter of traveling and disappearing, placing the drawing she'd made beside Paul's photo. Roots had returned. I wrote the last page in my notebook. Things I no longer apologize for. Wanting space, wanting more, saying no, leaving quietly, coming back louder. I made tea, and I meant it.